Good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the committee in 2020. Apologies have been received from Stuart McMillan, MSP. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and any members using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they're turned to silent. Our first agenda item today is evidence on the Northern Ireland Protocol as part of our Article 50 inquiry. And can I welcome the witnesses to the meeting, Professor David Finnemore, Professor of European Politics at Queen's University Belfast, Mary Spowage, the Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, and Aidan Conley, Director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium. Thank you all very much for coming to give evidence to us today. I guess perhaps it would be helpful just to start in a more general look at the protocol and where we are now. A majority of people in Northern Ireland, I believe it was 56%, voted to remain in the European Union. Do you think the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, which gives Northern Ireland partial access to the single market and customs union, will satisfy demands for a differentiated solution? And also, the protocol will place Northern Ireland on a different customs and regulatory footing to the rest of the UK. So could you perhaps reflect, in your view, what are the main economic implications of that particular solution?
Start by firstly thanking you for the opportunity to appear here today, and also for your interest in not only the Northern Ireland Protocol but Northern Ireland itself. As far as the protocol is concerned, we have been very clear, and the business community in Northern Ireland has been united from day one, and our message of this past 3 years has not changed. And that message is very simple, that for Northern Ireland not only to thrive after Brexit, but for us to economically survive after Brexit, we need unfettered access to both the EU market and to the Great British market. This has never been an either or. As far as the current plan that's on the table, well, quite frankly, it's better than no deal, and we'll have to accept something that is better than no deal. But by the same token, it isn't that unfettered access that we have asked for. It does provide a certain amount of much-needed certainty, but however, it also introduces frictions and complexities and costs that have never been there. Between NI to GB and GB to NI. Now, as far as for my own industry of retail, we are a low profit, high volume industry, and therefore we really don't have the ability to absorb any cost rises, especially because up until last year, I think Q3 last year, we had deflation in retail prices for many years, which was great for the consumer, but it did squeeze the margins for the retail industry. On the other side, you have the Northern Ireland consumer, and the Northern Ireland consumer has half of the discretionary income of Great British households. We're about £113 per week discretionary income. The national average is £213, and Scotland actually is bang on the national average at £213 as well. That means that the Northern Ireland consumer can't afford cost rises, but not only that, it means that those people who will be most affected by cost rises are those people who are most economically vulnerable in Northern Ireland. I think there's a lot of detail, and I'm sure we'll get into it over the course of the next hour or so, but just to finish off my opening comments by saying that there's a very, very simple equation here, and that equation is that if the new costs, those frictions, should there be tariffs, should there be non-tariff barriers, should there be checks, if those costs are higher than the profit margin, then either the product or the business model becomes unviable.
Thank you very much.
We were asked along because of a piece of work we did looking at different scenarios and the impact that different scenarios for the trading relationship between GB and the EU and the Northern Irish situation within that, how that would impact on the Northern Ireland economy. It's worth saying that we did this work prior to the protocol being agreed, so it was on the basis of the old backstop arrangement. But there is a scenario within our report which is not exactly the same, but similar, in that GB would be in a sort of free trade agreement scenario while NI was in a backstop scenario, which is not a million miles away from where we've ended up in terms of the protocol. And what's clear is that in these scenarios, there are trade frictions that will arise between NI and GB and NI and the EU, differentially perhaps on goods and services, but both of these things will have an impact on the Northern Ireland economy. So in terms of the degree of that impact, as I say, we haven't modelled the actual scenario that we've come to in the end, and there's a lot of practicalities to be worked out about exactly how this will work. So what the level of the friction will be, and also exactly what sort of free trade agreement we might get into between the UK and the EU is obviously still to be worked out. But it's clear that as soon as trade frictions are introduced, compared to the absence of Brexit, you will have an impact on the Northern Ireland economy.
Thank you very much. Professor Finnemore.
Okay, you asked, will the protocol be accepted? And I think, yes, there are considerable concerns around a lot of the trade implications of it. But I think if we just step back a little bit and think about what the protocol does achieve, it has minimised some of the disruption that Brexit will cause for Northern Ireland. It has avoided a hard border on the island of Ireland, which has economic, political significance. It has gone a long way to upholding the Good Friday Agreement and addressed some of the rights agendas in there. It has provided a space so that North-South cooperation can continue to operate. So from that perspective, I think it will be viewed positively. The problem is, though, this version of the protocol, the revised one, does raise significant questions about trade frictions, not North-South, which was what the focus was on avoiding throughout the process of negotiations, but East-West, as we've already heard. And so much is going to depend in terms of whether people will buy into the protocol and accept it, on how those are addressed. And at the moment, we've got considerable uncertainty around that, far more uncertainty than we've had at any point in the process of the withdrawal negotiations. Moreover, I think the extent to which the protocol is going to be accepted will depend on how it per se is going to be implemented, because it is very much a bare bones document. It does the absolute minimum to avoid friction north-south. It's not the most dynamic arrangement, so it doesn't provide particular arrangements for Northern Ireland in a range of different EU policy areas. And we're going to have to see how that's going to be implemented. And as already been indicated, so much is going to depend on the nature and substance of the future UK-EU relationship. And I suppose a big concern in Northern Ireland is that London will think, OK, the Northern Ireland dimension of this has been done. It's got its own special protocol, matter sorted. But that might have been the case with the May deal, but with the Johnson deal, it is certainly not the case. There's a huge number of issues to be addressed, and depending on how those are addressed, there could be significant economic consequences for Northern Ireland.
Okay, thanks for that. The withdrawal agreement bill says that Northern Ireland will be at one and the same time in the UK customs area and in the EU customs union. Now, the Prime Minister has said that there aren't going to be any checks at all. My understanding from evidence that we've taken before from trade experts is that that would actually be against international law, it'd be against WTO rules. Is that your understanding?
The withdrawal agreement states that the UK remains very much in the UK's customs union, but obviously the Union Customs Code applies to the United Kingdom in respect of Northern Ireland. So therefore, de facto, Northern Ireland is in the EU's customs union, but formally in the UK customs union. Now, there are some questions as to whether this is going to be acceptable to the WTO, but there is a security exemption which is allowed. And my understanding is it's always been negotiated on the assumption that, okay, Northern Ireland does have unique circumstances. There are particular challenges here, and there hasn't been objections, as far as I'm aware, from other WTO members to this particular arrangement.
Right, okay. If these checks go ahead, who would be carrying them out?
Under the original deal, the proposal from the Commission, it was going to be the EU, because it would be the EU's external border. Under this deal, the arrangements are to be carried out by the UK, but with the EU having oversight of processes.
Right.
So one of the questions for the transition period is to determine the arrangements by which that scrutiny and oversight is actually carried out.
The easiest way to sort of think of it as far as the both the implementation, who does what, and also the de facto versus de jure, is that the UK, for all intents and purposes in Northern Ireland, will be administering the EU customs and customs code and all the administration that comes with that, while de jure it will still be part of the United Kingdom.
I see. And where do you see these checks being carried out? Is it likely we're going to be visiting the southwest of Scotland in a couple of weeks' time? Do you see that having a implication on the southwest of Scotland, Stranraer and Cairnryan particularly?
So there's when we talk about checks, there are a lot of checks, and it really depends on what that FTA, the free trade agreement that is gotten this year, hopefully, will depend on what checks are needed. The closer the alignment of that FTA, it will change it from being a paper wall to a brick wall between GB, TNI and Scotland TNI. Where the checks will happen, that's yet to be decided. Usually it's everything has to go through a BIP and go be at point of entry. However, because there are certain checks, so we're talking about VAT, we're talking about excise, we're talking about customs, we're talking about sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and this is the way we have to look at it. Each of these are part of a jigsaw of the overall standards and things that have to be adhered to. There has been talk that there is some of those paperwork checks, should it be barcoding or whatever, that can be done in Cairnryan and Stranraer before they get to Northern Ireland. Other ones could happen at the Port of Belfast and Larne. It's one of those things that we're seeking clarity on. One of the concerns that we have with our members is about the just-in-time supply chain. So say you have something, perhaps the best way to illustrate it is to tell you about one consolidated lorry that would be coming from a depot in Scotland or in the north of England and going to Northern Ireland. So on that one lorry, you would have, say, about 1,500 products. And each of those products would have to have a separate tariff code. And each of those tariff codes would have to be spot on, otherwise they wouldn't happen. Each of those would have to be checked. Of those 1,500 products, you could have around 800 products that are products of animal origin, and each of those not only needs to have rules of origin certificates, but it also needs to have export health certificates, which has a cost to them. Each of those needs to be checked, and under that there needs to be a certain amount of physical checks to make sure what happens in or what's in the lorry is what it says. Now, all of that paperwork needs to be checked before it gets on the lorry. And all of this has to be done in a just-in-time. So we can have something that's coming from the south of Spain, comes across the land bridge and goes to Northern Ireland within a 2-hour window. But it's not the case if you miss a ferry that there's one in 3 hours' time, so you're fine. Actually, it's not a 20-minute delay, it's not a 3-hour 20-minute delay, but because of the way, especially when you're talking about supermarkets and groceries, whenever they arrive, they will go into a distribution centre with a large picking bay, and if you miss your window, then actually it's 24 hours. Now, we already have about 24 or 12 to 18 hours less shelf life than, say, Birmingham or Bristol because of our geographical location. But a lot of things within that just-in-time supply chain actually become unviable if there are delays. As far as infrastructure within Scotland, there has been already concerns raised about the need for infrastructure at Stranraer, the need for infrastructure at Cairnryan, but also the actual roads, because if you can imagine all of those checks leading to delays, there's, in the worst case scenario, you could be talking about a car park on the A75 and A77, and there's a real need to, as well as the economic impact of all of this, there's a real need for the government to look at what the infrastructure impact is going on the same way that the Department of Infrastructure in Northern Ireland is doing.
Right, okay, thanks very much. This is a specific point that you raised there. My understanding is that a number of the Northern Ireland supermarkets actually supplied from warehouses in the central belt of Scotland. Is that your understanding, and how would that be affected?
So it's not just the supermarket. So I always talk about that we represent the retail industry, and the retail industry is actually about 30 sectors. Now, a lot of this, because of just in time, is really, we're talking about with groceries and supermarkets and that sort of thing, but even through to pharmacy, and we have some indigenous suppliers. In fact, I came over early yesterday to talk to a couple of our members here, and they have grave concerns, not only about how they get their goods over, but also the cost implications. And it goes back to that simple equations that if the new costs are higher than the profit margin, then there's a viability issue as well. Also, the supply chain will always go the path of least resistance. So if that means that it's cheaper to get things from, or easier to get things through Dublin and up, or bypassing Scotland, then that could happen. Those are principles that don't change when it comes to when it comes to retail. The supply chain will always take the path of least resistance. There are huge concerns, not only from our Scottish Indigenous members and those people who have distribution centres in Scotland, but across the UK, and it means that Kernryan and Stranraer area will be that pressure point.
Right. Thank you very much. I'll move on now to Claire Baker. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. The protocol and the proposed arrangements for Northern Ireland have been portrayed as given an economic advantage to Northern Ireland by some. The Fraser-Founder report, which looks at a number of different scenarios, the scenario that Northern Ireland has a Northern Ireland-only agreement with the EU and there's a free trade agreement within the UK, do you think that is the most likely scenario? And if that is the outcome, the Fraser-Founder report has suggested that they would see a substantial reduction in trade with GB, which is the region's main trade partner. So if that is the most likely scenario, it doesn't look very advantageous to Northern Ireland, that description you've provided.
Indeed. So just a few things to say about the modelling that we carried out. As I said, you know, this was done prior. Yeah, so it's on the backstop arrangement that. So we did this modelling in the first half of last year. That's one thing to say. And there's a few things that it doesn't capture, and I just want to be clear about the sort of limitations of what we have done. So this is using a model of the Northern Ireland economy, which is built upon the economic accounts of Northern Ireland, and it sort of builds that on top of a number of equations on the behaviours of households and different actors in the economy. And this is a similar modelling approach that has been used by the Treasury and by the Scottish Government in sort of looking at the effects of Brexit. And one thing that some might be surprised about is that the level of impacts over the sort of the medium to long term, 15 years here, are sort of smaller than some other models that have been done, for example, by the Treasury and the Scottish Government. Now, one of the issues about this particular modelling is that we've just looked at the impacts on Northern Ireland. So it doesn't take account of secondary impacts that happen if Brexit has an impact on GB. So if in the long run the GB economy is smaller because of Brexit, that would also have impacts additional to the impacts that we set out. And in order to model that, you need a two-region model where you have Northern Ireland and you have the rest of the UK, you have GB, and you can model the impact that weaknesses in the GB economy would have on Northern Ireland as well. So that's why, you know, in terms of the change over a longer term period of about 2.7% off of GDP is smaller than some of the other impacts that have been generated from other modelling. So it is likely that if you did simulate the impact, that the long-term impact on GB, that the figures would be weaker again, as demand in GB for Northern Ireland goods and services is lower than otherwise would have been the case in the absence of Brexit. So just to point out the sort of limitations of this modelling, albeit I think the different scenarios and their relative impact give you a feel for the impact that frictions between Northern Ireland and the EU and Northern Ireland and GB give on the Northern Ireland economy. It's worth saying in this that the most damaging scenario that we looked at on the Northern Ireland economy was a hard Brexit scenario, where you have that hard border with the EU on the island of Ireland. Now, we only looked at impacts on trade. We didn't look at impacts on migration or on productivity or anything like that. And some of the other analysis, like the Treasury analysis and the Scottish Government analysis did look at those things, and those, again, would have larger effects. So we're looking at a partial picture here of the impact on the Northern Ireland economy. But even with that, you can see that these scenarios with different types of frictions have differential impacts on the economy and also have differential impacts on the different sectors of the economy, because there's trade in sort of different goods and services depending about whether you're looking at trade with GB or trade with the EU. So yes, but in all of the scenarios, you see that over the 15-year period we're looking at, you see an impact on trade and the overall size of the economy in Northern Ireland.
Because the Scottish Government have said, and they've expressed concern that Northern Ireland will have a competitive advantage in relation to Scotland. But part of what you're saying this morning is that or does that include a package? It's not just to do with trade, or is there does the current protocol provide some unintended consequences that the Fraser Vallender report has identified in a longer timescale, this issue of trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain reducing, even though that is Northern Ireland's main trade partner?
Indeed, so one could characterise the protocol as it currently stands as giving Northern Ireland better access to the EU market than GB. Yeah, I think that's fair. But what that doesn't take account of is the frictions that may be introduced between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Yeah.
And in terms of whether that's an overall plus or minus for the Northern Ireland economy, compared to any other scenario, depends on the frictions that then exist between Northern Ireland and GB, and the frictions that exist potentially for things like services between Northern Ireland and the EU, which is a we can't forget about a very large part of the economy, which is services. And a lot of these arrangements are covering goods, which is important, and it's obviously important for physical movements and things like that, and the practicalities of checks. But we can't forget about services, and if there's regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU on services, then that will cause also large frictions in trade and potentially impacts on the economy.
Mr. Conlon.
Sorry, if you look at it as far as having access to the EU, then Northern Ireland does have an advantage. Unfortunately, you cannot look at it in that singularity. It has to be a more holistic approach. Even if you look at the access that we do have with the EU, that's only guaranteed for 4 years. And there will be a vote every 4 years to see whether or not we wish to continue with that. If you look at, again, our own industry of retail and the Northern Ireland consumer, 70% of the value of all goods that cross the Irish Sea from GB to NI are for our members and for retailers. I'll go back to the point that we need both markets to survive. At the minute, under this deal, we have friction with our biggest market. We are talking about customs, possibly tariffs, talking about checks, new systems, delays, man hours to facilitate all of these things. So as far as the headline of us having access to the EU, and that is an advantage. Of course it is, but if you take that in the round with all of the things that are either uncertain or detrimental to the Northern Ireland economy and Northern Ireland households, I wouldn't argue that Northern Ireland had an advantage at all.
Just to give an example, if you look at trade between Northern Ireland and GB, which there's quite a lot of trade there. Whether it's because of reduced demand in GB, so more weakness in the economy than would have been the case in the absence of Brexit, or whether it's because of frictions. If you have a 5% reduction in trade between in exports from NI to GB, then the Northern Ireland economy will be 4% smaller. So, I mean, that's on top of these frictions that we've modelled in the report. We provide the sensitivity in the report as well. So it's just that gives you an idea of the scale that could happen if there is a reduction in trade between Northern Ireland and GB.
And can I ask another question and switch to asking about risk and the issue of goods that are identified as being at-risk goods, and that ties into issues around delays, I'd imagine. Just so I can have a better understanding, what kind of things what's likely to come into, I know it's to be decided by the special committee, but what kind of things is likely to come into a category of risk goods? Do you have any idea of what
anything and everything. I think that's one of the things that we'll be working on is trying to provide not only the joint committee. What we need from the joint committee is some generosity of spirit and some common sense decisions. If they look at it sort of subjectively, especially on the EU side, with the aim to protect the single market and the customs union in the south and the EU at all costs, then it's going to be very hard for us to prove that things aren't at risk. But if they have objective decisions and they look at the evidence, should that be through a mitigation such as a trusted trader scheme, should that be evidentiary based, for example, to show that us as retailers are dead-end hosts, and that means that things are only coming to Northern Ireland, not going any further, then there could be a sort of blanket ability to make decisions that things aren't at risk. As far as the products that could be at risk, you're talking about especially things where it is to protect the single market, those standards, and protect EU consumers. It's going to be things like foodstuffs. To protect the customs union, you're talking about things like alcohol, tobacco, those items which have an excise or duty on them. But it really depends on how wide both Her Majesty's government and the EU officials or ministers who make up that joint committee decide.
At risk, a lot of the focus at the moment is quite understandably on the EU's concerned about goods coming from GB into Northern Ireland and therefore being at risk of moving on into the EU market. There's a risk issue the other way as well, and this is being expressed by some of the UK's potential international trade partners, of goods coming into GB from the EU via Northern Ireland without checks, and therefore entering the market without necessarily complying to what the UK requires of goods coming in, whereas they would do if they were coming in directly from the EU into the GB market. And I think if we think longer term, if goods are coming in that route, they may be going on into the countries with which the UK has trade partnerships without necessarily fulfilling the checks that they require otherwise. Now, it's a small issue at the moment, and we don't necessarily see it growing, but there are concerns there that the UK may be needing to protect its market from goods coming into GB from the NI route, just as the EU is concerned about what's coming into its market from GB via Northern Ireland.
A quick example of that is if you have a lorry load of beef and it manages to get through to Northern Ireland and suddenly has a stamp put on it that it is Northern Irish, well, and then can go on to the GB market, you've just been able to not have to pay between 50 and 80,000 pounds worth of tariffs on that lorry load of beef. So it is a worry for our trading partners.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask questions around the democratic consent mechanism and in particular, Professor Fenor, your report. In your report, you deal with the scenario where the Northern Ireland Assembly is functioning and is also not functioning. Plainly, since the weekend, we see the welcome news that devolution has been restored to Northern Ireland. Do you have any general observations to make on the weekend's agreement? I note your report is dated the 6th of January, just before last weekend. I'm just asking for general observations, reflections that you might have on what you've written in the light of that.
Okay. I think, there is a supplementary paper, I think, which was circulated by my colleague Katie Hayward and I, which does look at the New Decade, New Approach agreement to try and tease out some of the implications of that for the implementation of the protocol. We're obviously still at a very early stage of the process of the Executive and the Assembly coming to terms with what's needed. I think in terms of the consent mechanism, we're obviously going to be in a position with the return of the Assembly and the Executive to have more informed debate within Northern Ireland among its politicians through a structured process of committees and also in particular the work of the Brexit subcommittee, which is being established as part of the executive team. I think we're obviously in a position where there will be, as I say, more debate, more discussion, and hopefully more consultation, so that we will be in a position when the consent mechanism is implemented, we expect November 2024, assuming transition isn't extended, whereby there will be an informed discussion and debate. But the return of the Executive Assembly doesn't fundamentally change the analysis that I had in that initial paper.
Thank you. I mean, one of the potential scenarios, perhaps the most likely scenario, is that the protocol applies every 4 years. There's obviously the 8-year application if we get cross-community majority of MLAs. But could you just can you anticipate what the strains might be on the political situation in Northern Ireland, given that time frame? And I'm particularly thinking in terms, for instance, of an electoral cycle that is also coexisting alongside.
Okay. I suppose an initial point, just responding to your electoral cycle question, the protocol was designed so that the consent mechanism would be deployed every 4 years so that each assembly would have a vote or have the opportunity to vote on the continuation of the protocol. I should say that when we're referring to the continuation of the protocol, the consent mechanism only applies to Articles 5 to 10. So it only applies to the continued regulatory alignment with the EU for the free movement of goods, the single electricity market, and the Northern Ireland's the application of the Union Customs Codes, the Northern Ireland de facto being part of the EU Customs Union. If those are voted down, the rest of the protocol still continues, which contains issues around North-South cooperation and also citizens' rights. Okay, so the protocol itself would not disappear. That said, when the vote does take place, it is on the package of all those alignment issues. Northern Ireland could not vote to stay in the customs union but leave the regulatory alignment on the single market. It couldn't keep simply the alignment to ensure the functioning of the single electricity market. It's a package. Okay, it's very difficult to know where we're going to be then. But I think what's interesting, and a number of commentators have pointed this out, that decision is going to be based very much on lived experience. And yes, politics is going to come into it. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are going to be voting on the basis of the actual experience of the implementation of the protocol. And as we've already heard, there are huge uncertainties there about what the economic implications are going to be for Northern Ireland. So it's very, very difficult to predict what's going to be happening 4 years down the line. On the other hand, however, if the members of the Northern Ireland Assembly do vote against the continuation of the protocol, they would effectively be voting for a hard border on the island of Ireland. Because if they don't vote in favour of the continuation of Articles 5 to 10, then the default position is that after 2 years' time, they will revert to whatever the UK-EU relationship is generally. And obviously we don't know what that is at the moment, but according to the British government, that's not going to be a customs union, that's not going to be participation in the single market to the extent that there'll be regulatory alignment. So all the frictions that we were trying to avoid over the last 2 years in securing the protocol would come back. And then that obviously has not just economic implications north-south, but political as well. Now, during that 2-year period, you could find other arrangements, but one must question the extent to which the EU's energy to engage with the British government on that question will necessarily be there, particularly when the protocol will have been rejected by a vote of democratically elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Just a couple more points, if I may. I think in your report you state that the provisions on democratic consent are unprecedented as far as the EU is concerned. Is that correct? Is that your?
Well, in terms of allowing part of a subnational entity of a non-member state to vote on the continuation of its legal relationship via the state with the EU, they are unprecedented, yes.
And also in terms of the, you make reference to the difference between the cross-community mechanism in the GFA and this. Could you just explain that a bit further, just for the purposes of the committee?
Okay. I think one of the interesting things about the democratic consent mechanism here is the members of the Northern Ireland Assembly, whether they're sitting or not, are being asked to determine whether a international legal obligation of the United Kingdom, which covers areas which aren't devolved, continues or not. Now, whereas in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, the consent mechanism only applies to devolved matters in the Assembly, or when we're talking about the question, the border poll question, and whether Northern Ireland is to remain in the United Kingdom or become part of a united Ireland.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Ross Greer.
Convener, to continue Donald Cameron's line of questioning, I'm interested, David, in what you were just saying around the scenario where if a majority of MLAs were to reject Articles 5 to 10, that triggers a 2-year process. If we are to be optimistic and say that alternative proposals are come up with, so that the situation is not to default to the wider UK arrangement, but alternative arrangements are come up with, could you just clarify, does the Assembly then, the Assembly could then in any circumstance vote on that, but is the Assembly vote on the new proposals in any way binding, or is that essentially consultative?
The understanding of the democratic consent process is if the Northern Ireland Assembly, or the MLAs, vote against the continued application of Articles 5 to 10, then Article 5 to 10 will go after the 2 years. Okay. There is no provision in there, and I've not seen anything to suggest otherwise, that Northern Ireland MLAs would have any vote on the future successor arrangements. Because the default would be they would simply the UK-EU relationship would apply to Northern Ireland.
Yeah. So part of my concern here is that given recent instability with the Assembly, that there is a scenario where, particularly by the concerns that the DUP have raised around the difference between the consent mechanism here and the use of simple majorities versus cross-community majorities, that there's potential for recipe for executive collapse. Every electoral cycle is going to have a moment of potential collapse, because at present, with the numbers that are in the Assembly, you can get a simple majority without a single unionist voting in favour, and you can get essentially the DUP hold a unionist veto because they have a majority of unionist MLAs. So even if every party but the DUP were to vote for it, you would still not have reached your cross-community criteria, because a majority of unionist MLAs would not have. And there are scenarios where, I mean, equally you could, depending on the numbers, apply that to Sinn Féin within the Nationals community. But that creates a scenario where in every electoral cycle of the Assembly, there is a moment where it's potentially the interest of one of the two major parties to collapse the executive, because the scenario that they want to play out is not the one that is playing out by a simple majority.
Yes. But if they collapse the... Okay, if the Assembly is collapsed at any point, you would still have a vote based on the MLAs that are in post, because the provision isn't that the Northern Ireland Assembly per se votes, but it's the MLAs vote. So if you have a collapse of the Assembly, the democratic consent mechanism will still be deployed, but with the existing set of MLAs. Okay.
Just as far as, you know, my bailiwick is definitely not the constitutional stuff, but even if you look at this purely through a business lens, you're talking that, yeah, what we've found with Brexit so far, leaving the EU, is that whenever there's a constitutional question raised, it provides uncertainty. Now, the one thing business likes is certainty, and what you're providing under this protocol is that there will, every 4 years, be that uncertainty. Especially if you're talking about small and medium enterprises, or even right up into the large multinationals. How do you do business plans that are larger than 4 or 5 years, because you don't know what the access to one, either or other of your markets would be? So, constitutionality aside, purely on business terms, the fact that there will be this rolling uncertainty is hugely detrimental to business.
Has there been any forecasting done on that? And I realise this is a totally unprecedented situation and forecasting would be challenging to do, but I mean, it seems obvious that something like foreign direct investment is going to be really challenged by this 4-year cycle. How do you persuade a multinational to come in and invest if it's 2.5 years or 2 years or 18 months away from the point at which circumstances could completely change and their business plan could become non-viable? Well,
even if you look at some of the large infrastructure projects, especially if you look in as far as energy, it's usually around 20 years, between 12 and 20 years before they actually start making a profit for the vast amounts of investment that needs and they need to put into the things like electricity grids and wind farms and all that sort of thing. So for us, it's not just about the simple who's going to support our businesses or where we're going to get that FTI for business. It falls down to the nuts and bolts of Northern Ireland's infrastructure, PFI projects, those things that are really needed to keep Northern Ireland moving.
Thank you. And just going back somewhat to where we started, looking at the provisions under Good Friday for North-South cooperation, my reading of this is that this is a very internal UK process. The UK and the Irish governments are the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, but the provisions in this protocol are very much internal for the UK, involving the Assembly and the UK government responsibility in coming up with alternative arrangements. But is it the case that essentially for the UK government to come up with any alternative arrangements, they would have to come up with them with the agreement of the European Union, and that is essentially the point at which the Irish government exerts its influence on this specific situation? There are other provisions in relation to the North-South Ministerial Council, but given the DP, for example, has concerns around compatibility with the Good Friday Agreement, not that they would be the advocates for greater involvement from the Irish government, can the requirement, the essential requirement for the Irish government's involvement be fulfilled by the de facto reality that any involvement of the European Union means the consent of the Irish government?
So in terms of any future arrangements to replace the arrangements that would fall if there were a democratic consent mechanism vote against the continuation of Articles 5 to 10, any adaptation to the UK-EU relationship to accommodate that, my understanding would be that that would have to be approved by the EU as a whole, which would give the Irish government obviously a direct say in the arrangements that were agreed. Okay. I would say also within the mechanisms for the governance mechanisms for the implementation of the protocol, we tend to focus on the bilateral UK-EU arrangements, but there are provisions within there which allow for the institutions established by the Good Friday Agreements, and not just the Assembly and the Executive, but also the North, South and East West bodies, to be playing a role in at least monitoring its implementation. And certainly as far as the North-South Ministerial Council is concerned, which obviously has Northern Irish and Irish representation on it, feeding in recommendations to the specialised committee, which then feeds into the joint committee on the implementation of the protocol. So there are other mechanisms through which an Irish dimension can be brought to bear on the protocol's implementation.
Thanks. And just one final question, Convener. Is there any interplay between the consent mechanisms as defined in this protocol and the process which in theory should now begin off the back of the agreement over the weekend on reform of the petition of concern as it currently stands? I realise they're separate processes, but the debate over the last few years around reforming the petition of concern has often proposed moving the petition of concern into a place that looks more like this consent mechanism than petition of concern as it currently stands.
My understanding is that a clear attempt was made to ensure that the democratic consent mechanism in the withdrawal agreement within the protocol was very much a standalone democratic consent mechanism, which nevertheless drew on the principle of democratic consent and some of the practices of democratic consent, but was designed so that you could avoid it being subject to the petition of concern. And that we can see that in the way in which it has been designed. So I don't anticipate any of the consequences of attempts to reform the petition of concern necessarily impacting on the implementation of this mechanism, although I think there's obviously going to be attempts in some quarters within Northern Ireland politics to try and ensure that the petition of concern can be applied to this mechanism. But I would say that this mechanism is not part of the Good Friday Agreement. This is very much part of the UK-EU agreement on withdrawal.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. As a supplementary to that, what are the implications of the continuing jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union having on Northern Ireland? My understanding is that it will continue to have a role.
It will continue to have a role in terms of the implementation of those obligations we've essentially referred to, Articles 5 to 10, and also any new legislation which is applied to the protocol of the European Union. Oh, sorry, yeah, EU legislation which is applied to the protocol. Yeah.
Okay, and what are the political implications of that continuing role?
We've yet to see, though. I think, yes, as a matter of principle, you are going to have resistance because this is a court. But equally, I think there will probably be an understanding that, okay, this is a court to which the UK has been a member for a long time. The principles which are likely to determine any rulings on the implementation of the acquis as it relates to the free movement of goods are probably going to be fairly consistent in line with what's happened in the past. So I don't necessarily anticipate too many surprises there. But that said, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and I think there would be, for some people, legitimate concerns that you have got a court from the European Union having jurisdiction over Northern Ireland for certain areas of legislation.
There's a sort of delineation between the political and the legal and enforcement within the protocol, as far as there's an expectation that the political arguments or negotiation will be conducted through that joint committee with expert evidence being given, and that the actual legal and enforcement part will take through the ECJ. Now, how that works in practice and whether or not we're able to keep politics out of it, I couldn't give an answer.
Thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Just picking up on that interesting area, I mean, it's fair to say, yes, that the acquis is the acquis, although it seems that many members of the UK government don't want to be part of the acquis on anything, be it goods or otherwise. But of course, as regulations change over time, and of course it's also for goods, state aid and environmental standards and so forth. So there could be, a different position in terms of the body of EU law that pertains that the court would have to have recourse to. And also the European Court of Justice has recourse to a kind of hierarchy of sources of law, and in terms of the way it interprets the legal position under EU law. So leaving politics to one side, I mean, that there will be political implications of that, but I mean, that is the legal position that the court is in. So I don't see that it's going to be an easy marrying of kind of part of a non-member state being subject to the rules of the game that apply to the 27.
No, indeed, and I think we could be seeing some of those concerns expressed fairly early on, because one of the things which we need to be aware of in terms of the regulatory alignment is that there's a very extensive annex indicating those pieces of legislation which will apply to Northern Ireland with the protocol coming into force. And if the EU replaces or changes any of those pieces of legislation, those will automatically apply to Northern Ireland. Now, there is a provision in there which would allow for new pieces of EU legislation which don't replace or simply amend those pieces of legislation listed in the annex to also apply to Northern Ireland in order to maintain the free movement of goods. Whether those do apply or not is to be left to a decision of the joint committee. So the UK would technically have a veto over that. The question to which we don't have an answer is, what would be the implications if the United Kingdom did not agree to that new piece of legislation applying to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, can I just clarify, because a really important, I think, legal issue in this regard, and it's not clear to me what the position is. So as far as the single market for goods is concerned, Northern Ireland is to follow the rules. But does that mean Northern Ireland is not deemed to be part of the single market for goods? It's a very important distinction as a matter of law. Is it part of the single market for goods, or is it just sort of unilaterally deciding to align itself with the relevant regulations in place?
Okay.
Because from that flow remedies for both businesses in Northern Ireland to invoke the protection of EU law and goods, and of course competitors to say that Northern Ireland, for example, in state aid, is not complying with the rules. So I'm not quite sure.
I'd prefer to leave that to a legal expert on that. But yeah, there are important questions there. the position we're in, it's not as though the UK is deciding to align. It is, according to the protocol, under a legal obligation to maintain alignment with those regulations. Those regulations continue to apply to Northern Ireland.
Well, then, you know, under EU law, it's very clear that you have remedies. So there's 4 fundamental freedoms, obviously. One is goods. If the Northern Ireland is part of the single market, then it is part of the legal system applicable, and therefore there are remedies available, which works both ways. Although it's interesting then where the Joint Committee veto would come in terms of access to the Court of Justice. And of course, with regard to the other fundamental freedoms, the Court has always taken the view that, you know, services, movement of workers and capital can be seen as part and parcel of delivering free movement of goods, and it applies equally to the other 3 fundamental freedoms. So the fact that you have per se excluded the other free movement issues is not necessarily the end of the matter, because if they are deemed to be essential in order to realise the freedom that is there, which is goods, that's yet another issue.
Yes.
I don't know, I noted that you were kind of looking interested in that, because obviously you're representing the
Yeah, so for us, you know, there are very there's implications of everything you just said for our members, and should that be for things going Northern Ireland to Great Britain, or things going Great Britain to Northern Ireland. There's a lot in it, and I think this brings up, you know, this brings up the central point for us in the business world, is that there are huge amounts of uncertainty here. The fact that the UK, for all intents and purposes, is administering the single market and the Union Customs Code in Northern Ireland, that the UK has agreed that it will be under the jurisdiction of the ECJ as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, and that administration, then it does bring lots of questions. It also then, if you could, it's that onion thing, every layer you go down, there's more complexity, and plus it makes you cry. But I have 14 pages of questions from our members on everything from VAT, at-risk goods, whether or not postage, you know, whether or not the Northern Ireland consumer, for bringing something from GB into Northern Ireland, then becomes an importer, and whether their goods are at risk, deliveries, internet sales, cost of consumers themselves, labelling, VAT, alignment and uncertainty. And the further that we go down this rabbit hole, or down on this journey, shall we say, it's a lot less contentious, the more questions that come. Again, I'll go back to the point that business likes certainty. And what we have is a lot of warm words, and we have a lot of promises and some commitments. What we don't have is specifics and detail. Now, that can be from legal clarity as far as our position now and in the future, and especially as far as if there are concerns and remedies needed, right through to the individual consumer and their responsibilities bringing things into Northern Ireland. We need to have that clarity. Part of it will come with whatever the FTA is that, please God, the UK ends up getting. But as far as where we are, you know, we need to get mitigations. We need to get common sense decisions by the Joint Committee that are based upon objective evidence. We need to get a generosity of spirit from the EU to allow those things to happen. We need to get mitigations and derogations, as I said. We need to look at alternative working arrangements. I was part of the alternative arrangements working group that was constituted by DEXU to look at what could be done north and south if there had been a border. My plea to the Minister for Leaving the EU and to Her Majesty's Government is, let's reconstitute that very quickly to see what sort of mitigations, should those be trusted trader, AEO, green and red channels, that we can get in place in the 11 months that we have. Quite simply, unless we get those mitigations, unless we get those derogations, unless we get the support on things like the new systems, on things like the detail, then we really are going to be in trouble as far as the Northern Ireland economy and the Northern Ireland consumer.
Okay, two more questions at slightly different areas. Going back to the issue that Claire Baker raised on the at-risk goods, just one question there. You know, how then, you know, to avoid smuggling on this, you know, it's night follows day. How can you do that without having some kind of border infrastructure, and then how can you have the border infrastructure north-south without then getting into difficulties with the Good Friday Agreement, the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement?
So there's a lot of questions still that need to be answered. As far as GBTNI, then there are going to be those checks, and it is on everything from VAT, SPS, customs tariffs. You have those customs code, all that sort of paperwork that comes from that. From NI to GB, there are small declarations that need to be done. However, over this past few days, I have been reading some of the research, and in fact, Pauline Bastidon from the FTA yesterday Freight Transport Association yesterday was saying that there could be some sort of checks from Northern Ireland to Great Britain as well. I think this, it keeps boiling down to the point that there is a need for certainty. As far as the illegality, and as far as the potential for fraud or VAT evasion or whatever, quite simply, it's a lot easier to police 3 ports and a couple of airports than it would be for the 200-odd crossing points with the Irish border. For all intents and purposes, because Northern Ireland will be in the customs union and will be administering the single market, there shouldn't really be that friction. The problem then is Great Britain protecting itself for things that are coming in, and the EU protecting itself from things that are coming from Great Britain.
One last question, perhaps for Mary Spowge in particular. I understand that the Secretary of State for Scotland has stated that the Northern Ireland Protocol will have no impact on Scottish exporters. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I mean, I was thinking this through while we were talking about the uncertainties of the actual practicalities of all of this and all of the questions that you've raised. And in terms of the impact of the protocol on the Northern Ireland economy, I mean, all of these uncertainties need to be resolved in order to even attempt to model what the actual impact would be, because in order to sort of try and quantify the friction that would happen on particular goods and services between Northern Ireland and GB and Northern Ireland and the EU, we need this information about exactly how it's going to work, because, of course, we need certainty around any tariffs that may apply in any circumstances, but we also need even more importantly, actually, it's the non-tariff barriers, these frictions that happen about paperwork and regulatory divergence, which are more important. So it's really difficult to even think about modelling the impact of this on the Northern Ireland economy right now because of these uncertainties. And even the modelling we did, which was based on the backstop and that persisting, this issue about potentially the protocol being temporary or being there for 4 years and then perhaps not being there. I mean, that's very difficult to kind of to model and to bring in that uncertainty about the persistence of this. And you can see that that could have impacts on business investment and everything else. So I think I find it difficult to think about the impact on the Northern Ireland economy given the uncertainty we have. Although we're developing this model to allow us to do this impacts of the GB economy on Northern Ireland as well, until we have the certainty about all these other issues, it's going to be difficult to quantify. In terms of the impact on Scotland's economy, one of the challenges about data within the UK is, and I'm working on this on another project, is about trying to measure the flows of goods and services between the countries of the UK is not easy. Because a lot of companies, particularly in GB, have their accounts at a GB level, and trying to actually talk about trade within the UK can be a difficult concept for a lot of companies, particularly when you're talking about services. But there is a significant trading relationship there, both in terms of actual exporting between Scotland and Northern Ireland, but also just sheer physical movement of goods, whether they originate in Scotland or stay in Northern Ireland or not. There are significant tonnages of goods going across the Irish Sea there between Scotland and Northern Ireland. I think whether there'll be an impact on the Scottish economy depends on the practicalities of how this is implemented and things like the infrastructure that may be required and other checks that may happen, and whether other routes, for example, are seen as more advantageous, such as through England to the Republic, for whatever reason, depending on the checks that happen. So I think it's quite uncertain what the impact may be, but it is certainly true that there is a significant amount of trading that goes on between Scotland and Northern Ireland just now, in terms of the impact.
So it might be a bit precipitate, therefore, to make such a definitive statement that there will be no impact on the basis of no facts.
I think
know
it's,
you can't comment on that.
yeah, it's difficult to quantify what the impact would be, whether it would be negligible or significant. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Did you want to come in there, Aidan?
No, just to say that there's also going to be displacement. We don't know what that displacement will be yet, but for example, I'll go back to that. The supply chain will always take the path of least resistance. So if there's more non-tariff barriers for the goods that would go usually Holyhead to Dublin, then we could see that they then will go up the extra 6 or 7 hours to get across from Carnarvon to Belfast or to Larne. As far as our own members are concerned, one of the guys that I was with yesterday, a quarter of all their estate is in Northern Ireland. Again, retailers, small profit margin, large volume. If the non-tariff barriers, then this is if they're not at risk and they won't have those tariffs in place, but the non-tariff barriers and the extra paperwork, if those are bigger than the profit margin that they have, then there is a concern about the viability of either products or there will be a need to change the business model completely.
Okay. Thank you. Kenneth?
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, I'm quite interested in issues such as mitigation. For example, there's a leaked Treasury report on the Northern Ireland Protocol unfettered access, which said, and I quote, customs declarations, documentary and physical checks on West-East and East-West trade will be highly disruptive to the Northern Irish economy. 98% of Northern Irish exporters to Great Britain are SMEs who are likely to struggle to bear this cost. And it goes on to say further down the document we have here that key employment sectors such as retail are likely to be hit, which you've obviously now Mr Connolly, you've spoken about mitigation and derogations. I'm just wondering if you can be specific about what mitigations you'd be looking for and what kind of derogations you'd be looking for, because obviously there'll be a financial implication to that, and I wonder what you feel that should be.
But let's be very clear about this. Northern Ireland is looking for a hand up, not a handout. This is very clear that this is a constitutional issue, this is a business issue, this is an economic issue. And for us, our main concern as retailers is to be able to continue to provide the Northern Ireland consumers and Northern Ireland households with the same availability and the same choice and the same affordability as we can today. Now that's going to be under pressure unless we get these mitigations and derogations. So the derogations will be from the Union Customs Code, and it will be to allow things to flow more frictionless than perhaps they do even with other countries with which they have free trade agreements or understandings. We will need that common sense decisions by the Joint Committee on what is at risk and what's not at risk. Now, there are going to be a couple of expert committees that feed into that. For us as business people, and perhaps one of the good things that's come over this past 3 years is that the business community in Northern Ireland have truly found their voice. If you told me 5 years ago I would be standing shoulder to shoulder with farmers, transport, manufacturing, I wouldn't have believed you, because usually we were taking lumps out of each other. But now we are working together, and we're very clear that we need to have access to that joint committee or to those expert committees so that they're actually looking at the practicalities and what it means in business terms and cost-wise. As far as the mitigations then, well, you're absolutely correct about SMEs, and even if a lot of our members are large retailers, but it's not about just us, it's about our supply chain. And they call it a chain, and it's only as strong as its weakest link. So what we have been doing is, over this past 3 years, is going down each layer to find out where those weaknesses are. Even as far as composite products, so we will have people who manufacture everything from foodstuffs to clothing in Northern Ireland, but a lot of the materials are coming from GB Scotland and even through GB from Europe. We will need to have those mitigations as far as things like trusted trader and AEO status. Now that's still a long and arduous process for large Retailers can take up to 18 months from application to getting your full status. In other cases, it can be around 9 months. But still, with having teams of people working on this, we still find it difficult. SMEs are going to find it near impossible. So whatever scheme they bring in has to be accessible and easy for small businesses to access. As well as that, we need to be looking at things like red channels and green channels to keep things flowing. We need to make sure that any of the paperwork is quite easily accessible. And there are a raft of things. I think the big concern about this is that, if I speak frankly, the 11 months that we have left before our next cliff edge. And in fact, we have 5 months until our next cliff edge when that decision needs to be made whether or not we're going to ask the EU for an extension in the transition period. Those 5 months and those 11 months don't really give us scope to get everything in place that we need to make it as frictionless as possible. We're pragmatic about this. We know that there's a change, and we know that there are going to be costs. We know that how we do business is going to change, and there is going to be a new normal. To protect the Northern Ireland economy and to protect Northern Ireland consumers, we need to have a lot of detail and a lot of hard work put into delivering mitigations in 11 months, and that's one of the reasons I would ask Her Majesty's Government in London to, as soon as possible, reconstitute the Alternative Arrangements Working Group to help design and deliver those mitigations.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. I mean, 61% of exports, according to the Treasury, from Northern Ireland are from SMEs, so I understand how vulnerable that sector will be. And timescale was an issue I was going to ask you about, so I'm glad you've actually touched on that.
Thank you.
Now, Northern Ireland remains aligned with the European Union on goods, including VAT on goods. I'm just wondering how you feel that issue can be resolved.
One of the really good things about the Theresa May deal was the wonderful, arrangement that was in there, that we would be part of HMRC and we'd also be part of VAES. Now, we in the business community were brought over by Article 50, or we went over to see Article 50 team before Theresa May's deal was published, and then after again. And before it was published, we were giving some outline points, and we said thank you very much, but no thank you. And they were quite surprised, but then we give them a list of the concerns that we had, and that's why you had things like QPs, qualified persons, you had recognition of qualifications that was in there, and then you had this wonderful thing about VAT, which had never been done before, and for us it was, wow, you've actually listened and you've delivered, so we were quite happy about this. Under this deal, there isn't that understanding under VAT, and for us, that does provide one of the biggest complexities. Take, for example, even on the VAT rate. So those food items which are seen as luxury items, so chocolate, crisps, and that sort of thing, have VAT on them. For us, for VAT, it's 20% in Northern Ireland. 23 in the Republic of Ireland. So there's a wonder whether there is going to be a dispensation, whether or not the VAT issue is going to put financial pressure one way or the other. And quite simply, it's something that we haven't been able to get an answer to. So that the Northern Ireland Protocol requires the application of EU VAT law, and one of the key areas being the application of zero rates by the UK and Ireland for food, children's wear, clothing and footwear. The loss of all or part of our zero rate would increase the cost for NI consumers. And then there's also, even if you go into the tax compliance costs and associated burdens, administrative admin time to prepare, third-party costs and filing, professional costs and fielding tax office queries, possible additional VAT return required for GB countries who have NI operations, given the requirement under the protocol for NI VAT revenues to be retained in NI. Again, cost, complexity, and again, no firm answers.
I thought it was going to take you 11 months to list them. Never mind. Deal with
Sorry,
them,
I apologise.
No, I'm not criticising. I think it emphasises the real complexity that there is involved here and the difficulty in dealing with it in the timescale available. I know Professor Finnemore, you were taking notes. I wonder if there's some comments you would want to make on that particular issue.
And I think it's just a general point, is the protocol provides a framework for the development of the Northern Ireland's relationship with the EU in the context of UK withdrawal. There's a huge amount of detail in there which needs to be sorted out. And I think whereas initially when the protocol was being put forward, there was an expectation that we would probably have a 3-year transition period for something which may or may not come into force. We now find ourselves in a position where we are faced with the prospect of 11 months to put in place a deal which has so many unanswered questions in it. Okay. And the pressure is going to be on. And the extent to which those issues can be addressed depends significantly on the nature and content of the future UK-EU relationship, but also levels of trust between the EU and the UK.
And Professor, can I just move on to ask another issue which you are involved in, which is obviously the issue of fishing. You know, one of the things that's been mentioned is that the question is not the fish and other agricultural products from the rest of the UK or third countries, but those brought into the EU customs territory by vessels flying the flag of the United Kingdom and having their port of registration in Northern Ireland. Now, fishing is a real concern, obviously, in Scotland, because there's concern that Northern Ireland might actually have a competitive advantage relative to the Scottish fishing industry in relation to this. I'm just wondering how you feel this the protocol is going to impact on the fishing industry and what that can mean both for Northern Ireland and indeed Scotland. And I'm not just talking about the fishermen themselves, but also processing.
Okay. I wouldn't say I'm particularly qualified to talk about the fishing industry or necessarily its implications. I think what you've obviously picked up is one of the points I put in one of my papers, is that one of the questions that needs to be addressed in the course of this year, before the protocol comes into full effect on 1st of January 2021, is the access which boats registered in Northern Ireland will be able to land fish in the Union Customs territory. Mm-hmm. Now, my reading of that is that currently boats which leave Northern Ireland ports could face restrictions on what fish they land in Northern Ireland. That's my understanding of the wording there. Now, their expectation is that this is going to be addressed in the UK-EU fisheries arrangements, but there's potentially significant consequences there for Northern Ireland fishing boats if that is not addressed and no agreement is reached within the Joint Committee on the implementation of the protocol this year. Now, my hope and expectation is there will be something there and it will be agreed, but I cannot see at present Northern Ireland fishing industry having any significant advantage over Scotland or other fishing industries in the UK as far as the protocol is concerned. It doesn't provide them with a privileged position in the same way that for goods produced in Northern Ireland, they have the free unfettered access to the EU market.
Okay, that's really interesting, actually. And just can you, if I may, just ask a question of Mary Spowage in terms of the Fraser-Vallender report. You've put in your report that under all Brexit scenarios, the Northern Ireland economy will be negatively impacted, whether it's GDP, exports, wages and investment. And we look at the kind of graphs you know, that you have actually throughout the document, we can see that specific sectors are affected quite disproportionately compared to others. So, for example, you know, agriculture, forestry and fishing sector and food and drink particularly impacted, and of course retail, as we've already discussed. I'm wondering, I asked some questions there which Mr Connolly answered in detail regarding mitigation and derogations, specifically for SMEs, etc., and for Northern Ireland generally. But I wonder about what can be done to mitigate the specific sectors that are going to be hardest hit in terms of the protocol moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, the sectors that are hardest hit in the modelling that we've done are obviously the sectors that have, depending on the scenario, a higher exposure to either the EU or the GB market. So, I mean, really, it's about supporting exporters really. So it's about focusing on those sectors who are likely to be exporting either into the EU or into GB. And you know, you see it's mostly it's food and drink, it's agriculture, it's the primary goods that are affected most significantly. But also we see effects from service trading into the EU potentially. So in our scenarios, we're assuming that there will be frictions between Northern Ireland and the EU on services trade. This is based on some work that was done by the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, looking at what the possible impacts of sort of non-tariff barriers on service trade between Northern Ireland and the EU after Brexit. So you do see that there are significant impacts, or there could be significant impacts on service trade. And that is a concern, you know, in terms of the overall impact on the economy, because it does form a large part of the economy. And although when you're looking at trade, a lot of it, you know, the majority of Scottish trade, for example, is still goods. It is still goods. But the growth in trade over the last 10 years has been in services. Yeah. You know, and we would expect that to continue as services become larger parts of you know, more advanced economies. So what's going to happen to services industries is a key factor, and a lot of the discussion on trade is really focused on goods so far.
So what should happen in order to mitigate in that particular market? Because, you know, it's almost as if you know, the bus is coming towards us, so to speak, you know, and you, rather than being run over, you would obviously want to try and do what can be done to kind of try and minimise any impact in these sectors, if that indeed can be done. I mean, obviously, what policy mechanisms or economic mechanisms can be done. I mean, Mr. Connolly said, "Want to hand up, not hand out," but it may be that there are. It might have to be a combination of both. I'm sure Northern Ireland politicians would certainly like a combination of both.
Well, it's difficult, you know, not to get into a political area
Indeed,
here. But from a purely economic point of view, yes. When you're thinking about services trade, any divergence in regulation causes friction, and therefore will have impacts on trade between partners. If there's divergence in regulation, then you have issues when it comes to service trade and goods trade. But it's particularly an issue for service trade. So from a purely economic point of view, the closer the regulation can be, the better. But obviously that might, you know, political reality comes into it, and that might not happen.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much. Mike Grumbles.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I want to take us back to customs and the impact on Scottish Northern Irish trade directly. So far, the questions and answers have been focused on Northern Ireland having to abide by the EU Customs Code. But the UK government has made it quite clear that Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom customs territory. So, if Northern Ireland businesses, maybe I'm misunderstanding and I'd like some clarity on this, maybe I've got this wrong, but if businesses in Northern Ireland have to abide by the EU Customs Code and have to abide by UK customs regulations, because of course what the UK government wants to do is have trade deals with the rest of the world and customs arrangements with the rest of the world. So these two things are different. And over time, Northern Irish businesses are they going to have to abide by both the EU Customs Code and whatever customs arrangements are negotiated for the UK customs territory? So, have I got this right? How can it do that? How can businesses do that in Northern Ireland over time, as you would imagine, as these trade deals come in? These customs regulations will differ.
Thought I might get asked this today, so I have put together the Institute of Government did a wonderful little press on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and if I quote from it, it says, "For Northern Ireland to Republic of Ireland trade, the EU's Union Customs Code apply, and there would be no tariffs or restrictions. Goods moving directly from Great Britain to Northern Ireland won't be subject to a tariff unless the good is at risk of being moved into the EU afterwards. And that's where we're talking about the objective rather than subjective thought on it. Likewise, goods from third countries entering Northern Ireland will be subject to the UK tariff unless they are at risk of being moved to the EU. For goods deemed at risk, the EU tariff will apply. If the UK tariff is lower and those goods are proved to have stayed in Northern Ireland, the UK can reimburse traders. The Joint Committee will establish further conditions under which goods coming into Northern Ireland from Great Britain would have to pay the EU tariff. Now, having to reclaim the differential has implications as far as cash flow. It also has implications as far as man hours. But as well as that, you know, those sort of decisions by the Joint Committee are going to be crucial for this. And there's going to be a burden on us as Northern Ireland businesses to prove what has stayed and how we prove that is in question as well.
How are you going to prove that?
Well, we're hoping that they will look at evidence that's there before. So, for example, us being dead-end host trusted traders, we have evidence to show that, for example, we have a lorry load of widgets comes from GB to NI and then reaches a distribution centre. And 8 of those widgets go to 8 different stores. And then we have a proof that they were sold in the store. Right, that's a lot of paperwork. But as well as that, what they're trying to prove is that we don't get a lorry load of widgets that come into a distribution centre and then it goes on another lorry and goes down to the south. So there is a burden of proof. What that proof has been or will be has yet to be defined. For us, it should be something as simple as proving the prior relationship that we've had and the prior delivery that we've had of those goods.
Mm-hmm. So, let me just take as an example then. If you have to abide by both sets of regulations, and you're saying you'll pay the higher, whichever of the two are, is that right? Yeah. So. And
then get a rebate if we can prove that it hasn't moved to the EU.
It hasn't gone forward. So, as you said, it corrects a huge amount of administration, especially for small businesses. I would have thought, even micro businesses, and I suppose they are. The political get-out clause, I suppose, for the government is that it said then this can be a democratic choice of the Assembly every 4 years as to whether they want to keep these arrangements. But is it really a choice? Because as I understand it, all the political parties in Northern Ireland don't want to see a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Is that correct? All the political parties don't want to see a hard border there?
There's been a lot of different interpretations of the way forward up until a few weeks ago. And a few weeks ago, over the Christmas period, we were able to bring together the business community and representatives from the 5 parties to lay down amendments that have been in the Commons and will be in the House of Lords next week. And what we are all of one voice on is the fact that we need to have a level playing field with the rest of the UK, and the fact that we need to have unfettered access both north and south. Before that, there were very differing shades of political opinion, but at the moment we're all sailing in the one direction.
So you want your cake and you want to eat it?
No, I don't. I don't think, you know, it goes back.
I'm only jesting.
Oh, no.
I mean, but the point I'm trying to make is trying to sort out this issue of trade, obviously in practical terms, but it's giving the Northern Irish Assembly a choice as whether it wants to keep this system. But I'm only questioning whether that's a real choice, because everybody seems to agree that if they voted against this system in 4 years' time and go back into the UK customs arrangements, that's not a practical possibility, is it?
In purely business terms, the uncertainty is unwelcome. In purely political terms, we simply can't say. The political ebb and flow in Northern Ireland has changed very much. The fact that we now have all 5 parties supporting the business community and vice versa to go in the same direction is something we're actually quite celebrating at the moment. But how long that lasts and what else politically or constitutionally happens within this next couple of years before we have the first question.
My comment really was based on the fact that it would first appear that Northern Irish businesses have an advantage because they can access the EU market and they're part of the UK customs territory. But actually, over time, as these two diverge, as we assume they will, otherwise what's the point? So they diverge, and actually it's going to add real costs in administration to Northern Irish business, and you'll be at a disadvantage.
That's exactly right. And the way that I sort of try to explain it simply is that if we have close alignment, we have a paper wall between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. If we have high levels of divergence, it's a brick wall. And for every brick that's put in that wall, the costs go up.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. Alexander Stewart.
This morning you've given us a good overview of the risks that are within the economy and within sectors of that economy, the risks that we have identified in infrastructure and the timescales that are there. And you know that one of the words you used, I think both of you, was about hope and expectation. You know, there's a lot of hope, but in the real aspect is expectation. And the trust of all of that is really being tried in the timescales that are tight. So I think, you know, we find ourselves in a difficult scenario, and you've identified all of the potential problems. But in all of that, creating a border within the Irish Sea has huge implications potentially for this to go in the wrong direction for many of the sectors. And as I say, the timescales are tight. And realistically, where do we really see ourselves in that 11 months' time?
Quite simply, we don't know. We in the business community are both pragmatic and realistic, and we're not ones to usually allow ourselves to go on flights of fancy, especially of hope. But there is a certain amount of hope now in the business community in Northern Ireland that we have a working assembly again, and with the new Brexit committee we will have a voice that will be able to stand up for Northern Ireland business. But let's be clear about this. What needs to be achieved in 11 months is it's a Herculean task. There's a lot to be done. Now, we have got reassurances from the Secretary of State from Northern Ireland, and from the Prime Minister, and from Robin Walker MP, the Minister for Northern Ireland, at the dispatch box last week. And we just need the detail and the specifics. As we've shown throughout this process, both in Theresa May's time and in Prime Minister Johnson's time, if we are asked to support, if we are asked to give evidence, and if we are asked to be both critical friends and cheerleaders for things, then we won't be found wanting. What we do need, though, is some very quick action. And again, I'll come back to the point about the need of the reconstitution of the Alternative Arrangements Working Group to look at what those mitigations can be in 11 months' time. And
you know, and you've identified that it's a mammoth task in reality, and the economic consequences and the impact that it could have is really detrimental, and that there has to be a real necessity for that action to be taken now, because if it isn't taken now, the businesses in your own sector, you know, you've indicated that you've got pages of questions, and some of these questions are being semi-answered, and others are not being answered at all. So that there needs to be a focus on what is imminent and what can be done in the short term, because the long term is also very problematic for the future. And we've touched on things today like smuggling. You know, that has a real there's a real opportunity there for some people, and organisations and individuals will see that as an opportunity, and it's how you manage that crisis, because that could be a real problem for everybody in many sectors, just by having that process there.
Well, I completely agree. And you know, to be fair, to give credit where credit's due, we have had very close contact with DEXU, we've had very close contact with BEIS, we have had immense support from the Department of Economy in Northern Ireland. And I think that they are similarly trying to work things through. And there's a lot on. But you know, a lot of people are saying, how do you know this and how will it be that bad and that sort of thing. We're not taking this from, here's the protocol, this is what could happen. We're taking this for things as simple as, for example, when there's avian flu in Great Britain, and suddenly there are those walls that come up, there are those checks, there are those extra bits of paperwork, there are those changes of licences which equal to delays, which equal to cost, and which have a very tangible economic impact. Now, if you multiply that, that's just on goods that would have poultry or eggs or that sort of thing. If you multiply that out by not only products that have of animal origin, but also things that could be deemed at risk, then there's a real tangible problem on our doorstep in 11 months' time.
And, you know, some people have indicated that there's an advantage to Northern Ireland out of this whole process, that they may be in a stronger position in some sectors, in some ways. Do you really believe that is the case?
I have the great pleasure of chairing a series of talks that have gone on between the Northern Ireland business community and politicians. We have a meeting every Friday this past few weeks, especially with the withdrawal agreement bill going through. And I can tell you that you have farming, you have dairy, you have meat exporting, you have the CBI, the IOD, the FSB, manufacturing, Northern Ireland, the Freight Transport Association, Retail NI, and the list goes on. And each and every one of those organisations that represent about 90% plus of businesses in Northern Ireland are very clear that this deal as is will be detrimental to the Northern Ireland economy and to their businesses.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do any other members have any other questions? Okay. Could I just ask about the scenario whereby we may not get a trade deal with the EU in time for the 31st of December this year? How would that affect Northern Ireland's supposed unfettered access to the UK single market?
Greatly. So we have a lot of, it's another one of those deadlines that's looming for Northern Ireland. If there is a no deal provision and we go to WTO terms or even if there is a bare bones FTA, there's so many of these are different things, synonyms, and bare bones and patchwork quilt and WTO and I can't believe it's not a deal. But as far as if we leave with no deal and there is that sort of WTO provision, then Northern Ireland has another great burden to carry. Especially if, and I'll go back to the fact that 70% of value of things that go across the Irish Sea from GBDNI are stuff for retailers. A lot of that will come through the EU. Now, it could be products that are using it as a land bridge. It could be products that are coming to GB to be value added, to be processed, that then go onto Northern Ireland shelves. All of those things, if there are tariffs, if there are costs that come from EU to GB, and then there is a great divergence, again, that is the difference between a paper wall and a brick wall. We're really hopeful, or we're having to pin our hopes on them getting some sort of a deal, because at the end of the day, a no-deal situation between GB and the EU is still detrimental to the Northern Ireland economy.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in there? You're all in agreement with that?
I think if we think back to the prospect of a no deal before we had the withdrawal agreement in place and the huge concerns of what that would mean for the Irish border in terms of the economy and movement of goods, checks and controls, if we leave the EU now without a deal on the future relationship, then a lot of the concerns that we had there in terms of the impact on the economy simply move to the Irish Sea and the border there.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. And my last question is more of a technical one. The new decade new approach states that the UK government will ensure that representatives of the Northern Ireland Executive are invited to be part of the UK delegation in meetings of UK-EU specialised or joint committees. Discussing Northern Ireland specific matters, that is, which are also being attended by the Irish government representatives as part of the EU delegation. However, Clause 34 of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill says that only UK Government ministers can exercise the functions in reaction to the Joint Committee on behalf of the UK. So my question is, who can represent the UK on the Joint Committee, and how are Northern Ireland Executive and Northern Ireland stakeholders likely to be able to feed in views to the Joint Committee?
Good questions. I think one way to think about it is the difference between delegation and representation. It's up to the UK government who attends those meetings, but ultimately in the Joint Council it would be a UK minister taking the decision. Okay. Right. Now the understanding is that because there is a specialised committee dedicated to the implementation of the protocol, which obviously has significant implications for Northern Ireland, there is a just reason there for including Northern Ireland voices as part of the delegation. And the same would apply when you get to the Joint Committee, when the decisions implementing some of the recommendations coming out of the specialised committee are taken, because you need that advice there. I think there is a lack of clarity at the moment about exactly how that's going to operate. And I would say there's actually some slight concern about the way in which the British government has phrased the question, or phrased the representation or the presence of Northern Ireland representatives as part of the UK delegation, that it's contingent on the Irish being present alongside the Commission, because it doesn't necessarily follow that there needs to be an Irish representative there alongside the Commissioner to justify someone from Northern Ireland being there. And so there would be concerns around that. What role they're going to have is still to be played out. Equally, there's another group which actually exists below the specialised committee, which is the Joint Consultative Working Group, which is, I think, going to be dealing with a lot of the fine detail of what's being proposed. And the British government has yet to be clear about what role Northern Ireland is going to have on that. I think there's a very good argument to say that Northern Ireland representatives should be there, and that should include civil servants and ideally go beyond that. Provision exists in the protocol for experts to be involved. Essentially because, as we've seen this morning, there are a whole series of very, very detailed issues really specific to Northern Ireland and the implications of the protocol, which I think the level of understanding around is probably most developed in Northern Ireland. I think if we do look back from the last 3 years, and I think you'll appreciate it from a Scottish perspective, it's not always been clear that representatives of the UK government have necessarily had the fullest understanding of the implications of Brexit and what it means for the devolved administrations, and particularly when we view it, I think, from Belfast and Northern Ireland, of what the implications are for us. Now, I think it's been that the level of understanding has increased enormously over the last 2 to 3 years. And we are probably at a level now where a lot of the issues which are being thrown up by the nature of the protocol that we have before us are understood well in Northern Ireland. And they're understood because there's been effective engagement between business and civil servants as well as politicians. But what we need to ensure is that there isn't a very centralised UK approach to this, that it's just UK government ministers there and UK Whitehall-based civil servants. If we're going to address all the issues which are in the protocol, you do need the understanding and the expertise that has been developed in Northern Ireland to be part of that process.
One of the biggest problems that we've had throughout this whole process is that we've had lots and lots of people talking about Northern Ireland and very few people who actually understand Northern Ireland, both the economic and political situation there. 3 words: access, access, access. We need to be able to meet with the expert committees. We need to be able to feed in. Over this past 3 years, that's what we've been doing with the Article 50 team, now Task Force UK, with the UK government, with the NI government, with the Republic of Ireland government. What our big ask especially over this next 11 months, is that the government, that the EU, and that anyone else who will be making proclamations or decisions on the future of Northern Ireland, that they work with us and they listen to us.
Right, and yet, that notwithstanding, in terms of the timescales, that needs to start happening now, but you don't have any certainty. Would that be the case? When do you expect to know whether you're going to be included?
I think that the spirit or the wording in the New Deal, New Approach obviously is recognition that there will be some Northern Ireland involvement in the process. But as you say, it is a very, very tight time frame. We've not got a clear sense as to what groups are going to be meeting when, what the agendas are. And I think the government needs to move very, very quickly on this to ensure that the voice is at the table, and we do address this whole range of issues which we've been highlighting today, and there are others, in good time for the protocol to come into force.
Is there a date for the joint committee meeting?
I'm not aware of a date being published. I think that there will be a reluctance to publish dates until the withdrawal agreement is actually finally agreed and ratified. But we're not going to know that until I think it's going to be the 30th of January.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. It's been very, 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 very helpful, although, as you say, there are so many unanswered questions. But thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And we shall now go into private session.